There are very few career homicide or career detectives who get into it just for the career and don't want to invest any of themselves in it. And maybe that's a good thing, because if we are representing society, we should also have feelings and have emotions just like the rest of society. We can't let them take over our job and negatively impact, so we tend to bottle it up or deal with it elsewhere. But to not experience it, we'd just be robots.
Welcome back, everyone. I had a very interesting police career and was involved with either the investigation or analysis of various different crime types, including murder. And this episode is basically the first one we've done as a response to a question that we've had to the pod. So a big shout out to Chris, who asked for this pod. He basically just asked us, talk about our experiences of homicide investigation and things like that. I've got to be honest, although I have assisted with some homicide investigations, it's not the bulk of my career. I'm not the person to ask about homicide. But luckily for him and for our listeners, Howard is. So on today's episode, I'm going to talk to Howard about his experiences of homicide investigation. So we'll crack on with that then. So Howard, we were talking off air about, okay, how we tackle this. And it's such a broad concept. And you quite rightly said to me, there's more than one episode here. This could be an entire series because it's so complicated and so deep as a subject area. But I think the best place to start from is to give people some sort of common ground. So the first question I wanted to ask you was, can you tell me about your first experiences of homicide investigation as a uniformed police officer? Maybe like the first one you attended or maybe the first one in uniform, where you weren't necessarily investigating it, but you might have been assisting with or attending that homicide.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for the question. Just to qualify what I'm going to say, I was a police officer for 34 years. I touched on murder investigation or did murder investigation with many different hats during my career, on and off. I didn't just do murder investigation. But these are my experiences. I was a uniformed officer on murders. I was an analyst on murders. I was a detective on murders. And ultimately, I was a deputy or senior investigating officer. That's the person who leads a murder inquiry. And then after that, I was even a review officer. That's somebody with experience who looks at murders and tries to find out where they went wrong or where they could be improved. So although I have a lot of experience, but having said that, it's just my journey and my experience. Murder inquiries are team games, whatever the media might make you think. And I was always part of a team, whether it be as a member or as a team leader. There are far cleverer, far more experienced and respected murder investigators than me. They will have had different journeys. Every murder is unique. So what you're going to get today is my journey, but there are many others out there. But hopefully what I'll be able to do is just correct a few misconceptions about what the public think about murder and what the real deal is. So to answer your question, my first contact with murder was when I was a uniformed constable. I was still in my 2-year training period, they call it probation, in the UK, and I got the job that everybody gets, guarding the scene. One of the things with a murder is they get reported to the police, and the very first scene that you get to understand as a police officer is the scene. It's usually where the body is found. There are many murder scenes, as you'll find out in murders, but that's the first. It's the most obvious one. So you've got a body and you want to protect the area from it being disturbed, to make sure that you can collect the maximum possible forensic evidence from that. It's controlled by the investigators, but the investigative team is always small, so they call in other resources to kind of provide support and help. So if there was a murder in the local town, call on the local police station to provide scene guards. And basically what they do, they put a perimeter around the scene that the investigators select, and you stand there in the cold and the rain and whatever. And the bottom line is that scene is protected. It's a no-go zone, except and unless you have the consent of the senior investigating officer.
Is it just you sole as the scene guard, or would you have other police officers stood with you?
No, you'll have others, you may have quite a lot if the SIO decides the scene is a large scene to be able to keep people out. I've known scene guards with teams and multiples of officers, uniformed officers. I mean, you can also imagine scenes are not always quiet places in the middle of nowhere where there's a body and just fields. So I know of a couple of scenes where they were in the middle of a town where ongoing violent public order was taking place. So whilst the police are dealing with all the public disorder, they're also trying to guard a scene where somebody's been murdered. Imagine trying to do that when you're not only guarding the scene, but you're trying to fight people off who are, breaking windows and attacking the police and everything else. Nothing to do with the murder. They just happen to be there. So it's an interesting place.
So this is in the early 80s, right? So I'm guessing, were you on patrol? Were you parading? How did you know to go to this? How did it work? Were you just given an order over the radio? How did it work?
Yeah, the situation is, I was just a normal patrol officer. We were detailed to that task by our supervisors. And when we got there, we were told what the scene was and where to guard by somebody from the investigative team. And what's really interesting about it is you don't just turn up and stand there. There's a log called the scene log. And this is a document that details every single person who attended at the scene and also entered and left the scene, including the time and the date, so that then the investigative team have a complete record of anybody who went into that scene area. Really important part of scene management. And the theory is that even if the most senior officer in the force turns up, the chief constable in the case of UK police forces, the scene guard will stop them going into the scene, even though they are their ultimate most senior manager, unless the investigative team say it's okay. Nobody gets in except by the control of the investigators, because otherwise the scene is what they call compromised.
So there's this Hollywood trope, I think, and it seeps a little bit into UK TV as well, of in most detective shows, the show starts as the body on the floor, detectives arrive, usually with a coffee in hand, and the uniform officer's there with a notepad saying, this is what we've got. So basically handing it. I'm guessing that's total fiction, and I'm guessing for our listeners, that's kind of not really what happens at all. I'm guessing that it's more, first of all, you've described a much broader team, lots more people involved, lots of other different functions going on. But I think that's probably the first big distinction and split from real life and TV is, in TV, the number of characters is very small, and the investigating officer is kind of a one-man band with some kind of supporting cast, where you're describing a much bigger kind of situation.
Well, the media and murder create an artificial story that's so divorced from reality that it either makes me really mad watching it and frustrated, or makes me laugh out loud. There's nothing wrong with that, but we forget that media is there for entertainment. So it's a product providing a different set of outcomes to a murder investigation. The murder investigation has got two jobs. One, establish that it's a murder and who did it. And two, once you think you know who did it, collect the evidence that proves that they committed that murder to a high enough level to put them in front of a court of law so that they are convicted and brought to justice. That's the murder investigator's job. The media's job is to entertain. So the link between media and law enforcement in general has always been an interesting one. And actually, there's a good question about cart following horse, or the chicken and egg. Because if you look back into the history of the detective, if you want to call it that, in the UK, almost before there were formal roles for detectives within law enforcement, there was the fictional hero, Sherlock Holmes. This was a totally fictional character created. This person who was sort of from the upper classes, highly educated, had scientific and knowledge about life that nobody else had. And this one individual parachuted in to complex crime scenes that were all artificial, where the police were bumbling about. And with his insight and his process, always got the murder detected and caught the culprit. That's just so wrong. It's laughable. But the media created that legal fiction around the world. And today, the English detective is seen, rightly or wrongly, as the cream of the crop. The homicide detective When I joined the police, I joined in uniform, and at that time there was no other way in. There was an element that would want to go from being a uniformed officer to becoming a detective. That was seen as a sideways step, but was kind of a little bit elitist. And I've nothing against being in uniform. I don't think there's any difference between uniform and detective. But that was the perception. You had to work and prove yourself to be a detective. It wasn't just a posting. And within the realm of detectives, there was almost a career structure at the very peak of which were the homicide detectives. They were the cream of the crop, fairly or unfairly. And largely, I'd have to say in my experience, in my time, fairly, because they went through more, they suffered more personally, but they did more complex jobs and dealt with more complex issues than other detectives. So you could understand that. And for me, as a career officer, to get to a point where I was a homicide detective, for me, I'd reached the pinnacle of my detective career, regardless of rank. Yes, it wasn't highly paid or highly promoted. That wasn't what I was there for. The function, what I was doing for a living in protecting the public, I was in the best place I could be in the most important job. But that was just my personal view.
I do want to talk to you about your first homicide detective job, but before we get there, any reflections or feelings about that first murder you attended, or a murder in uniform? Was there anything when you look back you think kind of that struck you or something, anything at all?
I was on the outside. I wasn't part of the investigation. I provided a scene guard. I didn't know what was taking place in the scene. I didn't know what the other elements of the investigation were. The investigation team wouldn't speak to me directly unless it was something to do with making sure I was guarding the scene. So I was purely a passenger. But that raises your curiosity, if that makes sense. And it made me want to know more, because what you could see were these very highly qualified, very highly regarded specialists, including scientists and civilians. I didn't know who they were at the time, going into the scene, and you thought, we're putting a lot of effort in here, compared to investigating other crime or disorder, things like that, or policing a public disorder where it would be virtually all uniform, just dealing with public disorder. So it intrigued me, because clearly it was complex and challenging, and I love complexity and I love challenges. So that was my first impression. In a way, that was kind of the spark that made me think, I want to do that, even though it would be many years before I could actually do it at the level that I wanted to do it.
Can we talk about your first homicide investigation as a detective?
Yeah, but it's a little bit wrong, or shall we say non-standard. From uniform, I became a detective, but the deputy force analyst for the force. So I wasn't a detective working on division, working on crime. I was trained in analysis and was loaned out by the Force Intelligence Unit, where I was based, to other inquiries to provide an analytical service that otherwise didn't exist in the organisation. So the first ever murder I was allocated to as an analyst was in an area of Leeds where a gentleman had been stabbed to death many times. And I remember leaving headquarters in my suit with my little suitcase of drawing tools, and as an analyst at the time, we didn't have computers, so I would take wallpaper or lining paper, which was a big roll of white paper, sellotape, because we didn't have blue tack then, or drawing pins, and I used to take coloured pens, together with my baby son had a toy where you'd hammer a round peg through a round hole and a square peg through a stair. So you ended up with a set of different shapes, and they were really useful for drawing round to make different shaped icons. And I can remember going to the incident room. What used to happen is most police stations had an incident room. That's a room designed purely for murder investigations or major investigations. When there wasn't an investigation running, that room was left empty and was basically sealed. It wasn't used. When there was a murder, they would call together a team from around the force, a team of experts, who would parachute in, man that murder team from that murder unit, and that's where the inquiry would live until the murder was finished. And then if there was a murder somewhere else, they'd go somewhere else.
And that's what we see in the media sometimes, like the whiteboards and the kind of the impromptu meeting rooms, and it's like, is that what the incident room kind of looked like?
Yes, and I can remember going, bearing in mind I'm a stranger to this team, and I walked into the incident briefing room, and I can remember the senior investigating officer, who was one of the most highly regarded detectives in the force. His deputy was another of the most highly regarded detectives in the force. The other detectives in the team were people that were well known. And I walk in as the newcomer and I start sticking white paper around the walls. And then I start asking them questions, and each of them tells me about what they've found in their inquiries. And I start drawing lines and icons on the wall. And you can see these detectives looking at me thinking, who is this alien? So again, I turned out to be an integral part of the team, because once they understood what I was doing and how it would help them, they put me to use. But I wasn't part of that initial investigation team. I was still an outsider, if that makes sense.
So you're making a physical timeline with the wallpaper? Okay.
Absolutely. You could walk around that room, round the walls, and follow not just a timeline, but also various other link charts and network charts of who was linked to who and who told who what and when that happened, and, a sequence event.
Because I think that's the other TV or Hollywood trope, isn't it, where the person presented with a complex situation, they have a cork board or a wall with all the news clippings, and they're using bits of string and other things. But actually, we should say that when analysts make timelines, I mean, now we do it digitally, right? But you're saying back then, pre-computers, you had to use lining paper to make and it had to be very long, because sometimes the timelines be very complex. Because I'm guessing, well, for people who aren't familiar, when you're doing timelines and analysis, you're usually having maybe a line for the victim, a line for potential witnesses, suspects, things like that. But it's essentially, it's like the Beer Tapestry, right? It's one big long visualization of, and you're attaching events chronologically speaking, so you can physically see things emerging in real time. But you're doing it physically, and you're doing it with the kids' toys for certain symbols, I guess, and things like that, right?
Exactly. And the thing is, murders by their very nature are complex. Murder investigations generate a lot of data, and making sense of that data not only is difficult, but it's also really important. You're not relatively speaking, compared to somebody who steals the wing mirror off my car, shall we say, or a pedal cycle from my garden. That's nothing like as serious as a homicide investigation, a murder investigation. And that of itself does two things. One, society looks at murder as the most impactful of all crimes. The result in that is they expect the police, the law enforcement, to bring people to justice far more than they do for somebody pinching the bike out of the garden or the wing mirror off the car. There's nothing wrong with that expectation. And we, the police, law enforcement, tend to put more resources in because it's such a serious crime. Somebody's died deliberately or been killed deliberately. We put more resources in and higher skilled resources. But that expectation is that we're going to come up with a successful result. We're going to find out who did it. We're going to bring them before justice, and they're going to be put in a place where they are no longer able to impact on society in the future and commit further murders or crime. That's true. But when you get to that point, making sense of that data really matters. And the way that you do it, it's not just finding out things, but the ultimate goal of that investigation is bringing somebody to justice in front of a court of law. So at every stage, your methodology has to be totally open to be challenged, because it will be challenged by the very best in court, and B, totally open to being explored and tested by other people at any stage. You really are. The truth is, although murder investigations are seen as very secretive, ultimately they are actually extremely open, because they get scrutinized by other police officers, by managers, by other stakeholders, by the media, by the public, by the courts, by appeal processes. Everybody wants a nibble to have a go at a police investigation of a murder. Nothing wrong with that. That's quite right and proper. Because if you think about it, historically, and still in some countries, one of the penalties for being found guilty of murder is death. And I don't think there's any more serious penalty than taking somebody's life. Secondly, if you don't take their life, they are often subject to long periods of imprisonment. In UK law, the traditional sentence was life. And there was a conversation for many years around, well, life should mean life. If you're caught, you go to prison until you die. You never come out again. That's changed over different years and with legislation, so that people do get out, they are released, but it's still the most consequential to the individual and the suspect and their families of any law enforcement or judicial punishment. So it's quite right; it should be challenged.
So let's do a recap then. So you're a detective. You're going to this incident room. A man's been stabbed in Leeds, and for our international listeners, that's a small city in the north of England, kind of industrialised. So the victim's been stabbed multiple times. You've been summoned to the incident room to support the investigation. There's some established detectives there, lots of kind of reputation and seniority in the room. I guess you were a little bit perhaps anxious or apprehensive maybe walking into that room, right? It must have made you feel somewhat awkward.
To say the least. These were, in a way, kind of my heroes of the day. They were very much what I would call now old school traditional detectives. The idea of appropriate language or being considerate and careful in the way that they dealt with people was not on the agenda. They were there to do a job and they did it in their own inevitable style. They were really good at it, but team members and shall we say the feel-good factor often suffered. People got hurt to get to the right result. And that's just how it was.
Yeah, and I feel like we should be explaining for our international listeners that Howard is being incredibly euphemistic here. I think what we're saying is very sweary, very authoritative, not, physical violence occasionally. I mean, even when I joined, I'd heard rumours of what we used to euphemistically call car park conferences, where people would have a professional disagreement and resolve it with a physical fight in the car park. It was a very robust atmosphere, right? I think and that's still probably a euphemism, but it's hard to get across to people who haven't been in that space just how it's a very macho, tough environment, right? It's very intimidating to try and, especially when you're inserted into something, right? If you're not part of a traditional process as you were, because if you were the analyst, that's what I'm going to ask you about next, is basically how the hell do you try and introduce a unorthodox tactic into such a kind of, we know what we're doing, get out of the way, we take some names, kick some doors in, we know what we're doing. How do you try and step into that?
Well, the first thing I would say is regarding the culture and the behaviour of people, you got to forget, these people were under stress that you and I and the public would not normally understand. Secondly, they were really good and really experienced at their jobs. And thirdly, and most importantly, they really cared. It's now well over a decade since I retired. I still maintain overviews of murder inquiries in which I was involved and victims families, and I will do so to the day I die. This is not just a job. It's kind of like a doctor in the Hippocratic Oath. You're trying to care for people. These people had a noble cause. I'm not saying that justified the way they behaved, but there was no doubting what they were trying to achieve by their methods. So that was the first thing. Secondly, I was never abused in that way. The worst thing I got was disdain, disbelief, challenge, but that's fine. You should expect to be challenged. And in that scenario, the weight of your argument and the quality of your work will decide whether or not you are respected or not, like any new person in an organisation. And I very quickly went, luckily, because I wasn't full of airs and graces. I am the analyst, thou shalt worship me. I'm here to try and help. Tell me if I can help. And if it's not helping, I'll go away because, I'm not short of work. And they very quickly, like any good detective, myself included, a good detective is a thief. They will steal anything and any method, any new approach that helps them do their job better and get to a result. And these people were not stupid. They were highly intelligent and were able to look and think, well, all right, he might look a bit funny and he's turned up with a suitcase and wallpaper and baby toys. But the moment they saw the value in that, they didn't care about that at all. And I've had people carry my baby toys and pass me the paper who were very senior detectives saying, here, get this for Howard, help him crack on with this.
So did your timeline help with that murder then? Is that in that first, I know it's probably your first one then, but
yes, so much so that whilst I was on it, I actually got selected for promotion. And because I was on the murder, I missed out some real promotion opportunities. I'm not complaining for a moment. I wouldn't have missed that experience for the world, but I was held back on the murder to my detriment and my career detriment because the murder was more important.
Can you give us an idea of how, just for people who are not from an analytical or police background, how does wallpaper around the room help with a murdering? I mean, I know you can't go into certain specifics, but as much as you can you give us any sort of indication? How does putting wallpaper around the room help a murder inquiry?
It helps the investigators understand the relationships between different elements of the information, the data, the evidence that they've got. Bearing in mind it is a team, there's a lot of information coming in from different sources, and not everybody is a party to each part of that inquiry. Different investigators, different team members will be looking at different aspects. But what they could do was they could come into the room and I could walk them through this storyboard, if you will, of what the information was at this stage and how it was related to other information. And that would allow them to make links in their head for what they're doing to other people. And then ultimately bring that understanding would result in new links or a realization that there was actually a gap in the links. There was somewhere we were missing something that we needed to go out and explore through other inquiries. It was that simple.
And I think something that's probably hard to get across to non-police listeners is that, and you may have a view on this, but my perception in the murder investigations I've been involved with is what took me aback was just the sheer volume of information. Because, and again, this is the distinction between what you see on TV and real life, is in TV, you've got the one or two detectives and the salient information points come across. There's usually no more than 3 or 4, and they may come all at once. They might start some inquiries, or they might get drip fed over the course of an episode. But I think when I came into contact with real murder for the first time, it's, you said, like at the start of the pod, it's like there's the crime scene information, there's the witness testimony, there's all the other kind of other lines of inquiry. There's so much volume of things, so many reports, so many indicators, so many measurements, that I think what's really difficult is it's hard for one person to manage all that. But when you have a team of people, it's really hard to have a shared experience of what's going on. Yes, you all know a body's involved. Yes, you all suspect a murder's been involved. But the thing is, it's human nature, right? Basically, if you were like the scene guard and then you were asked to do some door-to-door, you'll start to form your own kind of ideas and narratives about what might have happened. If you're the detective and then somebody tells you this is the body and this is something significant, maybe they found the murder weapon, that person starts to form a narrative. And this is where I think the timeline is kind of crucial, and people perhaps don't realize how visualization... I think there's 2 things crucial in your story that you've told me. Even if the wallpaper timeline didn't exist, having a situation room is important, right? Because it narrows the focus. It begins to kind of force people to have a shared experience of what's going on, what are the truly salient points, and come together some sort of collective view. And it sounds like that the timeline emphasizes that or turbocharges that to a certain degree. Is that fair?
It is, but it's one of many elements. A key thing of any murder investigation is effective communication, both within the team. So everybody is pulling, although they're all pulling in different directions, they're pulling to a common purpose and with a common understanding of the broader outlines. But secondly, communication outside the homicide investigation itself with the public through the media, with senior bosses, with local communities, specialist groups like forensic scientists or other kinds of specialist services. It's a really complicated thing to manage. It's like peeling the layers of an onion. And that communication process is, for me, the biggest skill of the senior detectives, to make sure that everybody can communicate effectively in a way that they're comfortable with. Very few people in an incident room are trained in analysis or to read these charts, even these days with the electronic tools that we use. They're not stupid, but they need somebody to guide them through the process. But the same applies to all other forms of data. I mean, I'll give you one example about volume. One of the things that murders investigations, like many investigations do, is have witnesses. And they'd capture the evidence from a witness by taking a witness statement, which even these days, is a written document, a formal written document. It can be half a page, it can be 20 pages, it doesn't matter. Those generally these days are converted into electronic documents. But before that happened, I can remember back in the 80s, a particular serial murder in my force where the number of statements taken from witnesses at one point went well over 300,000 individual documents. Those documents physically were so heavy that they started to collapse the floor of the building in which they were stored. Can you imagine that? Paper.
Well, you never see Inspector Morse or any sort of TV detective or Luther or something having to read 300,000 documents to you.
That's the other thing. Apart from the physicality, can you imagine anybody in the world being able to think, well, statement 132, page 15, line 32 mentions something. And I've just realised that statement 286,752, page 1, line 3, mentions the same thing. People aren't like that. You have to have some system that can allow you to make those complex links. Otherwise, those statements are worthless other than pieces of individual information. But that's the kind of volume issue. And today, even the simplest murder, say we seize a mobile phone and we download an individual's mobile phone. Mobile phones these days can have up to 2 terabytes of data memory. They can have cloud memory. They contain video, sound, messages, texts, sites they've visited, people they've spoken to, telephone logs and records. The volume of data in one person's phone is actually more than the volume data of those 300,000 statements from all those years ago. So the volume hasn't changed, it's got worse. It's just in a technical form.
And I think that's probably the other key thing for non-police listeners is that essentially, as with all the criminal investigation, you've got the really hard job of you have no context to which to judge this stuff, perhaps beyond the existence of a body, right? It's like, how do you determine what's important? Because obviously in the Hollywood context, victim might be a note, might be the last text message or the last phone call made. But as you and I both know, there can be hundreds and thousands of text messages, missed calls, dropped calls, email content, all that type of stuff, and trying to determine the significance and determine the context from the outside, because what fascinates me is it's a real mystery from like the first second, and then slowly, as people sometimes describe it as a jigsaw, but in some ways it's like making a jigsaw where it's like a hurricane of jigsaw pieces and you're just grabbing little bits and pieces, and sometimes a picture appears, sometimes it's the wrong picture, right? But it's nowhere near the kind of, as you alluded to with the Sherlock Holmes analogy, this breadcrumb trail of, arrive, massive clue number 1, massive clue leads to massive clue number 2, and you're following the breadcrumb trail. It's actually, no, sometimes you are overwhelmed with these breadcrumbs and it's pulling you in all sorts of directions, I guess.
You're right. It's even more than that, which I will explain in a minute. But coming to the media, I hate watching what you might call cop law enforcement programs, unless they're comedies or they show complete chaos. I used to like Hill Street Blues because everything was going off at once. It was kind of a war zone, and that sort of represented reality for me. That's the reality of a day in the life of a police officer. Or some of the comedies where you see the funny side of life, which again is an essential part of policing. If you haven't got a sense of humour as a defence mechanism, you can't deal with people. You can't be human. But the reality, think about the media. Some of the shows that used to be popular, I always remember Columbo or Murder, She Wrote. My wife loves murders, and she knows a bit about murder because she's married to an ex-murder detective. And I used to do murders when, I was investigating murders when we were married. It's not something before my marriage. Murder, She Wrote would come on, and there's the usual preamble music of da-dum-da-dum, Murder, She Wrote. And it brings up the list of various stars that are going to be in the episode that week. And then it brings up special guest star. And it would be whoever, special guest star. And he used to say, that's either the victim or more likely that's the person who committed the murder. How do you know that? Well, it's the only one that's disposable. Everybody else is part of the murder inquiry team in this fictional situation. They need to be around next week, otherwise there isn't a series. The special guest star is the sacrificial person who's going to be the one that the team catch. And then you go through the episode and, like you say, it's drip-feeding clues, and you're thinking, life isn't like that. I mean, on a real murder investigation, my start point was, firstly, is it a murder? And what I'm getting at there, if you decided to kill somebody, you have to have something in mind. You have to have a motive. Whatever the reason is, you've decided you're going to kill them, not by accident, deliberately. You're going to carry out an act whereby they lose their life. and die. And you intended that when you planned the act. It just happened by accident, like killing somebody in a road accident because you were driving badly. So, motive. That's before the murder. Then when you decide you're going to commit the murder, you start planning for it. It's called preparation. All the things you need to do. Well, if you're going to kill them by chopping the head off with an axe, you need to go out and buy an axe. You need to research which axe is the right one to take off somebody's head. That's preparation. The other thing is opportunity. You can't kill somebody until you can put yourself in a position to carry out the act. Sneak up behind them and hit them in a particular place. And once you've committed the murder, there's your subsequent conduct. What do? You run away? Do you try and evade capture? Do you try and conceal your trail by getting rid of a weapon or building alibis, all this kind of thing? So what I'm saying is, for the victim and for the suspect or suspects, it might be more than one person who's committing the murder, there's a timeline. It doesn't start with the murder. The murder is kind of almost the end of a timeline. And after that is dealing with the consequences of the murder. So that's the timeline for the suspect who were minding their own business, going around living the life until suddenly somebody jumped out of the bushes and killed them. The timeline for the suspects is we've decided we want to kill person X. We're going to plan it this way. We're going to do all the prep. We're going to buy weapons. We're going to do research about where these people go, what clothing we'll wear, whatever the preparation is, how to avoid CCTV, whatever. Then we're going to kill them. Once we kill them, we're going to do whatever we do after the event. That's not the timeline for the police, for law enforcement. The timeline for law enforcement, for most murders, almost all murders, is when somebody finds the body. Could be a member of the public. And what happens is they call the police, and then a uniformed officer goes around and says, yep, there's a body here. So they start calling the detectives, and ultimately it comes up to the homicide detectives. So we're entering that timeline much further along. That means we're always going to be playing catch-up. First problem. Second thing is, what are we actually looking at? Anybody can identify a dead body, a human being with no life signs. But how did they die? Was it murder? Was it accidental murder or manslaughter where, think about outside a pub. You have an argument with somebody, you punch them, intending to punch them. They fall down, bang their head on the curb and they die. That's not murder. You didn't intend to kill them. That's manslaughter in UK law. Not murder. For murder, you have to kill them, but you have to intend to kill them at the time you killed them. It's what you meant to do. It wasn't an accident for circumstance. So that's the first kind of, is it a murder just because it's a body? Second thing is, did they die of natural causes? People do just drop dead. The other point is, in law, in the UK anyway, when do they die? You could do something to somebody, or if you chop the head off, they're dead straight away. What happens if you poison them? In UK law, the person has to die within a year and a day of the act that led to their death. So if I poisoned you and you lived for 2 years, potentially it's not murder, even though I intended to kill you. It gets complicated, doesn't it? Well, we haven't even started the inquiry yet.
Yeah, I never knew that, to be honest. And yeah, I'm dreading the Google searches that are happening right now. But yeah, go for it.
What about the murders that aren't first reported as murders to the police, to law enforcement? Ring, ring. Hello, police. Yes, my somebody is missing. How do you mean? Well, they've gone missing. I don't know where they are. You'll see lots of reports of the police dealing with missing persons. Sometimes those people are missing because they're actually dead. They've been murdered, but nobody's found them yet. It's called a no-body murder. Because the point I'm trying to make is there's lots of situations where it's people die or events come to the attention of the police that are not murders. But when they do, until we can decide, yes, it's a murder or no, it's not, we always treat the inquiry as a murder. So we throw the best resources at it. We do the biggest element, the best evidence gathering and the quickest that we can. Because you can't go backwards and redo that work, because what happens is, because of these timelines, evidence decays. Forensic evidence. If you have a crime scene in the middle of a town, people are walking up and down over the crime scene, so it spoils it. Weather can spoil it if it's raining or it's snowing or too hot. If you think about the criminal, the suspect, they're moving all the time. The more time they've got, the further away they can get from the scene, the more they can do to damage the scene or damage evidence. Even witnesses' memories fail as they start remembering new things, or their memory changes. Technical data I'm old enough to remember when mobile phones used to capture messages, but the oldest text messages would fall off the end. So a mobile phone, for argument's sake, would only retain the last 100 messages. Well, if 101 was the message that talked about the homicide, the murder, you're kind of stuck. You can't recover what you've lost usually. So getting that evidence very quickly is important, which includes, is it a murder or not? The moment we prove it's not a murder, then we can calm down and deal with it in other ways, even natural causes. But until then, it's a murder inquiry.
One thing that we've touched on that maybe we should reflect on is when I described how robust the atmosphere used to be and some of the characters that we have worked with, I didn't mean to be derogatory in the sense that there are certain attitudes and behaviours that are simply not acceptable today. I'm not quite right. But I think your counter of saying, actually, it's the weight of things, the responsibility that these investigations come at a cost, right? And I think that's the other thing. What I noticed in the first murder investigations I assisted with is I've always treated the work that we do as serious, but there's something about homicide, I think, that weighs heavy. Oh, it did for me anyway. And I think, and I didn't have any of the really difficult jobs. I'm not having to tell families that they've lost a loved one. I'm not having to deal with dead bodies or very, difficult forensic scenes. And I think that's, did you have similar experiences? I'm guessing because I think that's where perhaps the overlap is between fiction and non-fiction is. So to give an example, one of my favorite, I'm slightly like you, 99% of cop shows I can't stand. I really like The Wire, and I would say The Wire is, I don't think you've seen The Wire yet, Howard, but I still, that's probably the best depiction of drug crime and other bits and pieces. More about drugs than homicide, but there's homicide investigation in there as well. And I think the overlap between fiction and reality is not the methods of how police investigations work, but you touched on it with Hill Street Blues. Hill Street Blues, for me, captured both the chaos of real life, the chaos in a police station, and the emotional cost of policing. As in, it would wear you down, and certain crimes would just slowly, over time, by attrition, just grind people down. And there's bits of that in The Wire. In The Wire, you get to see, in some ways, deeply heroic, but some deeply flawed people worn down by the things that they do. My other favourite police show is probably NYPD Blue. Horrendous for police procedures, horrendous for police investigative technique, but in terms of the impact of policing and the very human feelings of how you feel in those roles, talking to witnesses, talking to suspects, talking to people who you're not sure which side of the fence they're on. So I guess what I'm trying to lead up to ask you is, what was your experience? What was the cost to you emotionally? And did you see similar costs being taken against your colleagues across that similar time?
Yes, I did. I was very lucky in that the offences that I investigated, we never failed. We caught the suspects and brought them to justice, or at least caught the suspects, or found out who they were. But the other thing was, or we were partway through that, because some of these, as well as live, what you might call current homicide investigations, where somebody was murdered yesterday, go out and investigate it. I was also responsible for what they call cold cases, and I hate the term. Now, the way you approach them is not for this episode. They are a complex thing, and it's in their own right. But that weighs on your mind. And what you've got to remember is you're going on a journey, so you cannot avoid experiencing some element of what the victim and the families have gone through. Because it could have been, your family, one of your loved ones, or you. The other thing is, entertainment likes that kind of emotional content because it's entertaining. It happens in the real world. Don't get me wrong. You train and you prepare for it, and there are lots of networks for support and help, and cultural features of being a police officer and law enforcement that are all designed to help you and support you with that, which is all positive. Secondly, you understand, if you've done your research, that that's going to be the consequence of the choice of career direction that you take. I knew it would be like that. I had known senior experienced detectives or long service detectives who had been doing it for years, and I could see the impact on them. But I also saw how proud they were of the work that they'd done and the results that they'd achieved, and thought they've identified that the cost is worth the benefit. And that's a personal choice. It was one for me, and it was one for most of my colleagues. There are very few career homicide or career detectives who get into it just for the career and don't want to invest any of themselves in it. And maybe that's a good thing, because if we are representing society, we should also have feelings and have emotions just like the rest of society. We can't let them take over our job and negatively impact, so we tend to bottle it up or deal with it elsewhere. But to not experience it, we'd just be robots. Just one example. We've talked about TV shows. Think about Cold Case, the one that talks about, or CSI, two highly popular media shows. One, there's a boatload more action in those in an hour than there's ever been in a real homicide inquiry I've been involved in. Why? Because action's entertaining. You wouldn't enjoy sitting watching 8 hours of the day in the life of an incident room where they're sat around talking or looking at computer screens or going out and collecting evidence. It's not entertaining. It's relevant, but it's not entertaining. It's reality. The other thing is, have you noticed how they're all good looking? Now, obviously, this is an audio podcast, so you can't see my face, but let's just say I've got a face made for radio.
As have I.
Police officers are not, by and large, are not the best looking, particularly these people who have often worked long hours. I mean, when a homicide inquiry first kicks off, you've got too much to do, not enough time to get a grip. So you work, the button's pressed, and you work until you've got some kind of control and plan going forwards. Only then can you rest. That means long hours. I have worked I was trying to think, and I think the longest I've ever spent like that was just over 4 days, from getting the call to actually getting a chance to get some sleep and any proper food other than a grabbed cup of coffee or maybe a bacon sandwich.
Was that a murder or a kidnap? A murder that was on concurrent. Wow, okay. The longest I did, I think, was 2.5 days.
Kidnap's another matter.
Yeah, well, we'll do a pod on kidnap later. But
don't
what
get
you
me
say
on kidnaps. Wow. Yeah. And the point, I've slept on sofas, I've slept on chairs, I've slept on the floor, but you don't get a chance to shave, have a wash, brush your teeth. So, if you look at most old detectives, experienced detectives, life has a toll on them. They certainly don't look like Cold Case. The incident rooms don't look like Cold Case or CSI. All these fancy screens, they're missing out all the crisp wrappers and the sandwich wrappers and muck on the floor and dust and detritus and dusty old boxes and stuff that smells. I can remember a freezer. Imagine a chest freezer, and when you open the lid and you looked in, the bottom of the thing was full to several inches of a red-brown liquid and bones. And it wasn't human in the event. It turned out to be animal parts. But what had happened, they'd stored these parts in this freezer from a homicide inquiry. And then the freezer had got turned off like 10 years previously. You go and deal with that as a crime scene. You don't see that on Cold Case or CSI. Somebody throwing up at a crime scene. And it happens all the time because we're only human.
I just want to maybe take a few minutes to talk about why police officers and staff have the feeling to bottle things up sometimes. And obviously, we've got the obvious stuff, horrible situations and difficult circumstances. But I remember some advice I got from a different inspector, who you and I both know, who basically what happened was I went on my first drugs warrant into essentially it was a drug stash house. So it was a very run-down, very poor household, went in, absolutely filthy. And the heartbreaking thing was there was a couple of drug users there and they're in a state, but there was a couple of incredibly young kids there in levels of filth, and that I'm not going to go into much more detail, but it was still with me. It's still one of the worst things I've ever kind of, as you said, seen, smelt and been present to. But when we came away from the scene and we're in the back of the van heading back, and again, this is just one of those weird police things. This van was a normal van, but in the back there was no lights or anything. It was just a box van that had been converted. So we're all sat in the dark talking about what we've just been on. And I'm still trying to process all this stuff. And I'm absolutely raging at this point. I'm kind of like, my blood's boiling. And then I hear some cops talking in the dark and they're laughing about it. They're joking about it. They're making kind of references to this obscure TV program that was on the time that involved cleaning and blah, blah. And all I could see was I was boiling up and boiling up and boiling up. And I remember getting out of the van and I remember and sorry, it was a sergeant then, he kind of grabbed me because he saw that I was going to go walk up to these cops that were just making a mockery of it. And he physically grabbed me and pulled me to one side and he said, let it go. I can see you're upset. Yes, what you saw was messed up, but for you, this is your first time. For them, this is like the 30th they've done this year. They are just using humour to deal with this because you're going to be going on these all the time. You're going to be seeing these all the time. He says, I know you're quite young in service, but he says, what you have to learn to be real, and I'll never forget it. He said, to be real police, what you have to do, he says, don't show anyone that you've been rattled, that you're upset. He says, if you have to go into a cupboard right now or the toilet and shout, scream, cry, punch the wall, whatever, do whatever you have to do in private to get your head round this, but never let anyone in this team or anywhere else see that you're struggling. Because if you can't hack it, you're going to get moved on. And from that point, and I'm not necessarily condoning all of that advice, but that was a lot of pressure for me at that point. He had where I agreed with him was, yes, I was taking it too seriously. Yes, I can understand how later became to understand how humour is a coping mechanism. But that was pressure to subdue how I was feeling, to be part of that team, a little bit like I imagine what you described that team of detectives when you first walked into that incident room. So what's your take on that kind of brave face, you can cope, you can get on with it? Does that resonate with what you've had as well?
A little bit. I mean, what you're talking about there wasn't a murder, you said so. But law enforcement, the police, deal with all kinds of stuff like that every day. They deal with the best and the worst in society, and we're all human beings. There's two things. Number one, you can't help having emotions, but those emotions can help or hinder you in doing your job. If you went to a dirty house that you would not live in to talk to people, forget homicide, murder. You just go into a house to interview somebody about something or a neighbour complaint, and you walk in and the house is filthy and the kids are running around in rags and there's no food on the table and it's cold. Personally, you might be completely disgusted by it, but that's how those people choose to live. Who are you to judge? You know, they are members of the community. They are deserving of the same respect and courtesy and fair treatment as the highest in the land, just because they don't live how you would live. There's a saying, you should police people in the way that you'd like to be policed. I always think that's a bit false because people have different standards. So if you did that, you wouldn't have one level of service. If you had a police officer who, for example, wasn't respectful to other people in the way they spoke, or they didn't wash, they smelled, or they had bad breath, or dressed scruffily, would that help them in their job? Probably not. But on the other side, the idea that psychology matters couldn't be more true. In stressful situations, it has been proven that it's how humour is designed for us as creatures, never mind law enforcement, police officers. As human beings, we use humour as a kind of a steam vent. It allows the steam off. It's a way of coping with extremes of emotion or extremes of situations. And the police use that, law enforcement use that as part of their team processes. Does it mean that they don't feel? No. But as you say, visiting a scene or seeing a particular thing that upsets you once is bad enough. Can't tell you how many dead bodies and body parts and people of all different races, ages, men, women, babies, I've seen in different scenarios, post-mortems where they are cutting the body up and examining body tissues to establish the cause of death. To most people, those would be horrors, but they are a necessary part of my role, and I have to find a way of managing that, and humour is a way of managing it. It's not meant to be disrespectful or discourteous. If you can't use humour or find a way of managing it, you wouldn't survive. It's kind of like the military as well. You could say the military. I've got many colleagues from the military who've got what I think are really awful or perverse senses of humour. They find their humour in the most morbid, horrible things. But to be fair to them, they're not going around saying that in public. It's something they use amongst themselves. And they are seeing some morbid, horrible things in life. just as we do in the emergency services.
So I'm not saying you did this deliberately, but you didn't really answer my question, because my question was kind of, in any time in your service, were you put under pressure, either explicitly or implicitly, to kind of contain yourself and to restrain yourself and to kind of not show your struggle, or to basically make the struggle private, to kind of take a step back? So that's what I'm driving at.
Yes, I was. I put myself under that pressure, not necessarily linked to murder investigation, but I remember when I was a uniformed constable, one of the things that we had to do sometimes was what they call death warnings. Where somebody dies, you have to go around and tell the family who didn't know. Horrible thing to have to do. And I had a job where an elderly gentleman, I think he'd been walking his dog in the local park and had just collapsed from a heart attack and died. And I was tasked over the radio to go to an address and notify the people at the address, which was his home address, that he died. And then you have to get somebody to come and identify the body and all the procedural stuff. I didn't know who would be at the house. And I got there, and there was a lady who was the deceased wife. And I went inside to explain. I sat her down, tried to get some family around, did everything I could be to be professional and supportive, to give her this awful news, this shock. And it was a natural death. Unfortunate, but it's not like a murder where somebody's been killed needlessly, shall we say. And I was trying to be very professional, conscious of her feelings and sensitive to her feelings, but not have any of my own that would take over. But I started crying. The reason I started crying was a few weeks before my own father had died suddenly from a heart attack. And as it happened, this was the first time at work when I'd had to deal with death since. And came away from that incident, went back to the station, and I can remember discussing with colleagues and supervisors. I was really upset and embarrassed that I'd cried in front of this lady and had to explain to her, look, my own father died, so I apologise for my reaction. It's nothing to do with your scenario. And I was really embarrassed. And then a few weeks later, I received a letter at the station from the lady, which said, listen, thank you for being so sensitive. It was a shock when you came round and told me, but actually the fact that you'd gone through that experience and were also upset was actually a comfort to me, because we were able to share grief. Now, from a policing professional point of view, that was inappropriate. What happened? I shouldn't have done that. And I would, had one of my officers done that, I would have tried to counsel them and support them and explain why it wasn't appropriate to drag your emotions into a scenario. But it just shows one of the best sides of policing sometimes is when that kind of professional front drops just a little bit, not to be unprofessional, but to be human. Really show that you understand and sympathise and empathise with a situation that a member of the public is in, because it's very easy to be hidden behind a uniform or a police car or a badge and not be a member of the community. And good policing is being a part of the community.
No, thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that. I know it's probably not easy going into that level of detail. The reason why I went there was that I think with murder in mind, I think, again, something that perhaps although they do it badly, something that's reflected in fiction, as you say, it's a source of entertainment. We'll leave aside whether it's right that it's a source of entertainment or not. But these things do come at an extreme cost. And I think in all policing, and also murder, that you have biology and psychology, they call it mirror neurons. Your sympathy is instantaneous, right? When you see a situation, you can imagine it sets your mind going. It reminds you of things gone past. You said a few minutes ago you've seen countless bodies over countless years, and that comes at a cost. Two schools of thought. You're dealing with absolute horrendous things. Do you suppress everything, push everything down, try and minimize everything, keep professional, keep online, keep focused, and just kind of plow through? That comes, and I totally understand that that's bad advice. And there's a number of people right now screaming, what are you talking about? It's a horrendous way of doing it. And I'm saying that's one view. I'm not saying I support that view. You have the other view that says, no, almost after every single trauma, to manage your well-being, you need to be engaging with mental health services. You need to be exploring different things. You need to be kind of managing the triage, if you like, of how things affect you. Try and manage your mental health as you go, because if you don't do that, the amount of complex PTSD cases in the police is absolutely crazy. But some people say that you can over-explore those feelings. You can overindulge, you can you could be part of your suffering too much. And I do sometimes wonder where that path is, because I know there's colleagues right now that are navigating that. Do I push everything down? Do I embrace everything? So we won't have a time to do it today, but I just wondered from your perspective, your homicide investigation career spans decades, and I imagine you probably joined early 80s pre-PACE, or just as PACE was coming, pre-PACE, and all the way through to the early 2000s. And I know you, we've been friends a long time. I know that you kind of use strict method and process and professionalism as a shield to get through these things, and you do keep a professional distance. Is that something you've had to nurture over those years, or have you always, since you got into the job, just had that as a defense? It's just things perhaps, because I'll be honest, mate, I think that you deal with things way better than I ever did. And even though I've tried to train myself over years to deal with very, very difficult things, although some of the most difficult cases are all false dealt with. So if you don't mind answering that, I'm just curious what your take on it is.
Well, I have to say, I'm sure some of it is just my nature. I am by nature a worrier. I ferret away at things and reflect on things. But there's a very good book that we both love called Thinking Fast and Slow, which talks about how people think. And sometimes the slow method of thinking, the slow part of your brain, takes lots of time to gather the evidence, mull it over, and come up with a balanced decision, a rational decision with loads of thought processes behind it, loads of reasoning. The other one, thinking fast, is kind of the reflex action, where something happens, you've got incomplete information, but you just have to deal with it. Now, when I get faced with an emergency situation, and this is even in my private life, I'm pretty good at dealing with it. Just do whatever needs to be done for survival or to get control again or minimize damage. I might worry the hell about it afterwards, but the fact that I dealt with it in the first instance means that usually I've minimized the impact, whatever that may be. And that's me as a human being. Yes, my training and my approach and my preference is for slow thinking. Take time, collect the data, tease it, pick it over, worry about it, look at it from different points of view before I come up with an opinion. That's my preference, but it's not good for survival. And I trained as a scientist. Throughout my law enforcement career, one of my skill sets was the ability to deal with that complex data and rationalize it. But so part of it is what I was born with. Part of it is training. Within law enforcement, I think it's a balance. When I joined, there were very few processes or support systems, what you might call external advice, psychological support, mental health. These terms just didn't exist, but people still had those problems. They had those experiences. And the way they dealt with it was drink, humour, that kind of team camaraderie. So there's always a need to deal with it. It may not have been successful. These days, I'm delighted that our understanding of it is far better. Our exploration of it has taught us a lot. So my view of law enforcement these days is, one, we understand these stresses that apply. Two, we are far more open to people discussing them rather than bottling them up. And three, there are lots of support services out there for law enforcement to seek support other than the humour and the support of their colleagues. That's not to devalue any of them. They're all equally as important. But what I would say is there's no one right answer. One extreme is bottle it up, tell nobody, just live with it. Other extreme is tell everybody about everything and spend all day long dealing with your feelings. Neither of those are appropriate as the default for being a professional police officer, never mind a human being. I think there's a balance. And it always makes me think of food. I know that if I eat bad foods and takeaways, I will get fat and be less healthy. But there are times in my life, either through preference or through circumstances, where I eat those things. But there are other times when I eat really healthily. And I think the same is true of our mental situation. There are times when we go for the junk food, and there are times when we go for the healthy option. And bottling up is and humour and alcohol are the junk food, and professional support and proper reflection are kind of the healthy food. And we all end up wherever we end up. But the other thing is, it's very easy to generalise. And these are individual people having different experiences. Like you say, yours is different to mine. For every other member of the organisation that we were part of, it would be different, even if we all experienced exactly the same situation. That's before the fact that they're all different. Like every homicide is different. There are general rules, but everyone is different.
I think that's a perfect place to wrap things up. So I wanted to thank you for being so frank with us today, Howard, and thanks for going through all that. If anybody listening to this wants us to talk about maybe any other aspects of policing, and in a similar way, we've covered murder today. I say we've covered murder. As Howard said earlier, homicide investigation, forgive me, is so broad and so complex, we could do 10 episodes on it. But if there's something specific people want to hear about, please get in touch. We'll be happy to have a look at it. So thanks for today, and I'll see you all again. Take care.